Okay, so I'm going to say something about the kind of the broader educational context in which you might use the Bingham Pact if you're a teacher, which you might think about how schools construct a response to fundamental British values. The first thing I want to point out, though, is that if you listen to the radio, if you follow the press, barely a week goes by without the answer to some social, political, economic problem being the curriculum. So I was listening when I was listening, obviously listening very attentively to the first two speakers, but I was thinking, this falls into that list. So in the last couple of months, I've heard people call for schools to deal with internet safety, with teenage sexual health, with personal financial education, that's a recurrent one at the moment, with careers, healthy eating, first aid. I think it was a bill going through the House of Parliament last week that was calling on every child to be taught first aid as an essential part of the national curriculum. It got talked out. And now we've got anti-extremism. Now, there is clearly something schools could be doing in response to all those agendas and anything else you fancy throwing into the mix. So the challenge of schools is, what do? You could just respond to each of those calls for action in a very piecemeal fashion. And what you end up with is a lesson on this, a lesson on that, go down the corridor, get a lesson on something else. It doesn't add up to anything other than a complete incoherent hodgepodge. So the challenge is to find a way to construct a properly educational curriculum which gives teachers and children spaces in which to explore those issues. Because otherwise what we're doing is just using schools to promote a particular solution rather than give children the capacity for dealing with those difficult issues. And so what I'm going to suggest, I'm here from Middlesex University and from the Association for Citizenship Teaching, so what I'm going to suggest is, won't be a surprise to anyone, that citizenship is the educational vehicle for dealing with all of these agendas. The first thing to say about prevent is there are two strands. One is a kind of child protection issue. Anyone who's at risk of being pulled into any form of political extremism that would lead them to do something that was dangerous for themselves or for others is a straightforward child protection issue, and there is a process in every school to deal with those kinds of issues. But there is a second strand, which is what we're talking about. We're talking about promoting fundamental British values, which is a much broader. That's not just for the one or two kids who are going to be sucked into extremism and very unusual forms of ideological education outside of school. This is for everyone. When you talk about what schools should do as a response for everyone, then you're talking about a much broader educational response. And it can't be the same as the response you adopt when you're worried about individuals' well-being. So what's that response? Well, the response has to be put in some form of critical education for democratic citizenship. So I'm going to talk a bit about what it means when you translate this agenda into a curriculum for learning. The first thing to say about citizenship is we need to think about this as a schools issue. Okay? Subjects exist so that children can learn. Schools are to enable people to learn, not for politicians to brainwash people into doing what the politicians have decided is the right way to do things. So when teachers deal with any subject, they're dealing with things at different levels. It's become very trendy at the moment to talk about surface and deep learning. So I'm going to be trendy for a moment for my teacher colleagues here. Now this is very literal, the surface representation of knowledge. If you're a citizenship teacher, you teach these things, bobbing along on the crest of a wave. This is the stuff that fills your days in the citizenship classroom. But the purpose of teaching about those things is not just to inform people, because that's another one of those baskets of stuff you need to know about. The purpose of teaching people these things is to relate them to the deep learning. And the deep learning in citizenship, the stuff that will promote what we're currently calling fundamental British values, that we might prefer to call the values of democratic citizenship, are to understand what democracy is, justice, rights and freedom, equality, power, government and governance, and also the skills, how we ask questions as citizens, what it means to think politically, to develop critical analysis of information that we're presented with, to read the newspapers critically, to develop informed opinions, not just assuming that children suddenly given opportunities to tell you what they think something which is well informed and rational, but to give them opportunities to develop their opinions so they are well informed and increasingly rational. To give them forums to develop those skills. So this is what the National Curriculum for Citizenship is. It was very clear in the first two versions of the national curriculum, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the same people who've cooked up fundamental British values and prevent as educational agendas have made it less clear in the way that they've constructed the curriculum. But all of those things are there, either embedded in paragraphs left, right and centre. There used to be headings in the curriculum structure, but now they're kind of more deeply embedded in the wording. But there are concepts and there are skills. But I would also argue, as a teacher, you can't teach this surface stuff in a coherent way unless you are making connections to the deeper concepts. So not all of these are listed in the curriculum, but I would say a citizenship teacher needs to bring them in to give coherence to what they're doing. So that means we need to think really clearly about what it is we're doing in terms of providing learning opportunities. Michael Young, who's written a lot about the curriculum, is currently talking about the curriculum in terms of two types of knowledge. Is the curriculum as it's currently constructed just reflecting the knowledge of the powerful, or is it doing something else which is providing children with powerful knowledge? And I just want to say something briefly about those two and then apply it to what Bingham are trying to do. So the first category is knowledge of the powerful. Knowledge of the powerful is that straightforward political messaging. It's citizenship education, I would argue, which already knows all the answers to all the big difficult questions. Having worked out what all the answers are, we then put that in the curriculum and we go about telling children and testing them by rote until they can commit them to memory and then reproduce them in the test. So what or who is right, what or who is British, what constitutes British values, what's the right thing to do when confronted with different forms of extremism from the right, from the left, from religious minorities. All of those questions can be answered by politicians, put in the curriculum, and we just have to make sure that children understand it. That's a curriculum which represents knowledge of the powerful. It feels more like indoctrination, and I would argue it's profoundly anti-education, because education should open up the process of learning and reflection to different possibilities. It should be an exploratory process in which children are cognitively challenged to make sense of the world in different ways. If you've already done all of that, and you're just presenting people with one-dimensional answers, then it's not educational. You're using school to something else. So the alternative to just presenting knowledge of the powerful is to present powerful knowledge. And what makes powerful knowledge in citizenship, I would suggest, is these things. Citizenship education, which provides children with a body of knowledge which is transferable, in the sense that they can use it to inform their own interpretation of a range of phenomena. So think about what's genuinely useful in this regard. The surface level is only useful for specific purposes. The deeper level is more useful in a range of contexts. This is the kind of knowledge you can use in unexpected contexts, in the context that the citizenship teacher doesn't have time to talk about. But if you've learned those deep conceptual issues, if you've learned to approach issues in an open-minded, democratic way, then you can seek answers to questions which are thrown up in your communities, in your families, wherever else you might be presented with things which seem to be moral conundrums for you. So powerful knowledge is powerful because it releases your imagination to understand the world in ways which aren't limited by your own direct experience. So that's what Michael Young says about what we're doing when we construct a curriculum subject. What does that mean for us in terms of citizenship? Well, thank you. I'm going to argue that what borrowing now from Schulman, who writes a lot about subject knowledge in the curriculum, there are three ways to think about subject knowledge in a curriculum subject where we should understand the rule of law and fundamental British values. The first is the kind of factual knowledge that fills lessons. That's that surface level stuff. The second, we need to be very clear about is the kind of conceptual framework which constitutes this way of thinking about issues. So those are the core concept stuff that we've been talking about, and the rule of law is clearly one of those, and it's an understanding of the rule of law is kind of made up by using all those different concepts that Joey was just talking about. But then there's a third level almost, which is Schulman calls the epistemic rules of the subject that you're working in, and it's just to point out that looking at a problem like global warming or ISIS as a citizen within citizenship gives you a different frame of reference and a different way of understanding the problem than if you look at it through religious education and try and argue it from a theological perspective, or if you look at it from a mathematical perspective or a geographical perspective. So there are these different ways of making sense of what's going on around us in the world, and citizenship is one way. So if you're thinking about global warming, you can look at that from a purely scientific point of view, you can look at it from a geographical analysis, or you can look at it from a citizenship perspective. What's important about this third dimension to citizenship teaching is that you begin to understand what's distinctive about asking questions about citizenship. And that is obviously linked to asking questions that relate to core concepts like democracy and the rule of law. So we're helping young people understand what it is to engage with some of these contemporary problems as citizens, drawing on the store of knowledge that we've built up as citizens, thinking about citizenship, and that becomes empowering, not because you know what the answers are, but you know how to ask questions afresh and to think through those problems independently. So it seems to me one of the contributions of the rule of law material is to think about these three dimensions. On the one hand, this is another way to approach in a coherent fashion teaching about the courts, the Human Rights Act, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and all of those other things. This is their kind of superficial level, but it's useful to know those things because they are important. Secondly then, it's also more powerful, I would say, because it enables you to go back to that fundamental conceptual level and to ask some important questions. So Joe always put me right on this, because I was one of those people last week who thought the rule of law was just a vague invitation that democracies work better if most people follow most of the laws, otherwise democracies tend not to be democratic anymore. So I had that kind of instinctive understanding, but it's now much clearer, and having had a look at the education pack, that it would kind of open up this deeper conceptual learning. But then the other thing to say, and the third dimension, is that it's really helpful to be explicit with children when you're making a point in the context of the rule of law. How do you argue a point? How do you make a point? Because at some point you might be arguing, according to the rule of law way of looking at the world, it seems to me that there are some problems with the way that we've currently configured legal aid, for example. But you need to understand how it is you make a compelling argument in the tradition in which you are asserting a point. So I think there's something important there about inducting children into making arguments and to engaging with, if there's something in your guts that makes you feel the law's wrong, not fall into some relativistic model which says, well, I am going to follow laws if I agree with them, but which inducts you into a way of reasoning which is, well, how do you reason through that? What are the issues? Do you think it's wrong because actually when you look at issues of access, there now appears to be a whole group of people who don't have equal access? Do you think it's wrong because when you look at how the law proceeds in reality, there seems to be a whole bunch of people who get locked up for breaking those laws, but other people who seem to break them don't find their way through the court system? So it's helping children articulate that and present their arguments in a way which could demand that other people pay attention to what they're doing. So that's by way of just kind of a snapshot into one way to think about the citizenship curriculum and the way it can connect to teaching about the rule of law, to stop it just being a free-floating 6-week project that never gets mentioned again. It needs to fit into something which is communicative and built up, and which has a chance of empowering children to read the world in a critical way and help them understand what democratic citizenship is all about.